The dusty wooden ladder creaked under my weight as my daughter-in-law Crystal forced me to climb into the sweltering attic that would become my new bedroom. At 68 years old, with arthritis in my knees and a heart condition that made stairs difficult, I was being banished to live like an unwanted piece of furniture in the cramped space above their garage. "This is temporary, Vera," Crystal said coldly, not bothering to help me with my suitcase. "Just until we figure out what to do with you." What Crystal and my son didn't know was that the phone call I was about to make would expose their cruelest intentions and transform me from their unwanted burden into their worst nightmare. If you think family betrayal has limits, subscribe now, because what happened next will shatter everything you believe about unconditional love. They say blood is thicker than water, but apparently nobody told that to my son Derek when he married Crystal Martinez and decided his 8-year-old mother was an inconvenience to be hidden away. Standing in that suffocating attic in Reno, Nevada, surrounded by cobwebs and the smell of old insulation, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my family was about to change forever. Let me take you back to understand how I ended up being treated like cargo instead of the woman who raised my son single-handedly for 18 years. My name is Vera Blackwood, and until 6 months ago I thought I had a wonderful relationship with my only child. I'm a retired seamstress who spent 40 years working at Reno's finest bridal salon, helping thousands of brides look perfect on their wedding days. After my husband Frank died of cancer 12 years ago, Derek was my anchor, my reason for getting up each morning, and what I believed was my greatest accomplishment as a mother. Derek is 35 now, a successful insurance claims investigator who makes good money examining accident scenes and fraud cases throughout northern Nevada. For years after Frank's death, Derek would call me every day, visit twice a week, and include me in every major decision in his life. When he started dating Crystal Martinez 2 years ago, I was thrilled that he'd found someone who made him smile again after his difficult divorce. Crystal seemed perfect at first, a 2-year-old dental hygienist with a warm smile and an impressive ability to make Derek laugh. She was originally from Las Vegas, had moved to Reno for work, and claimed to be excited about becoming part of our small family. During their courtship, she would bring me flowers, ask about my seamstress work, and even requested that I teach her some basic alterations techniques. "I've always wanted to learn sewing," she told me during one early visit, her dark eyes sparkling with apparent interest. "Derek talks about how talented you are, and I'd love to have you show me how to hem pants properly." I was charmed by her enthusiasm and touched that my future daughter-in-law wanted to learn skills that had been my livelihood. When Derek proposed to her at Lake Tahoe, I cried happy tears and immediately started planning ways to help with their wedding. But the moment they returned from their honeymoon in Hawaii, Crystal's entire personality changed. The warm, interested woman who had courted my approval was replaced by someone cold, calculating, and increasingly hostile toward my presence in Derek's life. It started with small comments about my interference in their relationship. When Derek would call me, as he always had, Crystal would make passive-aggressive remarks about mama's boys and men who needed to cut the apron strings. When I'd invite them for Sunday dinner, a tradition Derek and I had maintained for over a decade, Crystal would suddenly remember previous commitments or claim to be feeling unwell. "Derek, your mother calls too much," I overheard her saying during one visit to my small apartment near downtown Reno. "It's not healthy for a grown man to be so dependent on his mother's approval. We need to establish better boundaries." But the boundaries Crystal wanted weren't about healthy independence. They were about erasing me from Derek's life entirely. She began intercepting my phone calls, telling Derek I'd called when I hadn't, or claiming I'd said things I'd never said. She'd schedule activities during times when Derek usually visited me, then act surprised when he couldn't make our plans. The manipulation escalated when Crystal started making comments about my living situation. I lived in a modest 1-bedroom apartment that I'd been able to afford on my seamstress pension and Frank's small life insurance policy. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, comfortable, and filled with 40 years of memories from my marriage and Derek's childhood. "Derek, I'm worried about your mother living alone," Crystal would say with fake concern. "She's getting older, and that neighborhood isn't as safe as it used to be. Maybe we should think about finding her a nice assisted living facility where she'd have people to socialize with." But I didn't want to socialize with strangers in some sterile facility. I wanted to maintain my independence in the home, where I felt connected to Frank's memory and close to the life Derek and I had built together. At 68, I was perfectly capable of caring for myself. I still drove, cooked my own meals, maintained my apartment, and volunteered at the local animal shelter twice a week. Crystal's campaign against me intensified after she and Derek bought their house in the affluent Coghlan Ranch neighborhood. It was a beautiful 4-bedroom home with a 3-car garage and stunning views of the Sierra Nevada mountains. During the housewarming party, Crystal made a point of showing me the guest room that she said would be perfect for when Vera needs a place to stay. The implication was clear. She expected me to eventually become dependent on their charity, and she was already planning how to control the terms of that dependence. The crisis that led to my attic exile began 3 months ago when I fell in my apartment and broke my wrist. It was a minor injury. I'd slipped on a wet floor after mopping and landed awkwardly, but Derek immediately went into panic mode about my safety living alone. "Mom, this proves you shouldn't be by yourself anymore," he said during my emergency room visit, his face creased with worry that I knew was genuine. "What if you'd hit your head? What if no one had found you?" I tried to explain that accidents happen to people of all ages, and that one minor fall didn't mean I was incapable of independent living. But Crystal seized the opportunity to push her agenda with renewed force. "Derek's right, Vera," she said with false sweetness, while I sat in the hospital bed with my wrist in a cast. "At your age, living alone is just too risky. We have plenty of space at the house, and this way Derek won't have to worry about you constantly." The idea of moving it with them filled me with dread, but Derek was so worried that I agreed to stay temporarily while my wrist healed. I thought it would be a few weeks, maybe a month at most, and then I could return to my apartment and my independent life. That was 3 months ago, and what I've endured in their house has been the most humiliating experience of my adult life. From the moment I moved into their guest room, Crystal began treating me like an unwelcome intruder rather than Derek's mother. She would make comments about how my presence disrupted their routine and suggest that I was taking advantage of Derek's generosity. When I tried to help with household tasks, cooking, cleaning, laundry, she would criticize my methods and tell me I was doing everything wrong. "Vera, that's not how we fold towels in this house," she'd say with exaggerated patience. "And I prefer to do my own cooking because Derek has specific dietary requirements that you don't understand." But the worst part was watching Derek transform from the loving son I'd raised into someone I barely recognized. Crystal had him convinced that catering to my demands was enabling unhealthy dependency, and that the loving relationship we'd always shared was actually emotional manipulation on my part. "Mom, Crystal thinks you're being too clingy," Derek told me one evening when I'd asked if he wanted to watch our usual Sunday movie together. "She says it's important for me to focus on my marriage now, and that you need to find your own activities instead of relying on me for entertainment." I tried to explain that I wasn't being clingy. I was trying to maintain the close relationship we'd always had while respecting his marriage. But Crystal had poisoned his perspective so thoroughly that every attempt I made to connect with my son was reframed as manipulation or neediness. The final humiliation came 2 weeks ago when Crystal announced that I would be moving to the attic space above their garage. She claimed the guest room was needed for Derek's work equipment and that the attic had been converted into a comfortable living space for me. When Derek showed me the conversion, I nearly cried. It was a cramped, poorly ventilated space with a tiny window, no air conditioning, and barely enough room to stand upright in most areas. There was a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a space heater that would be my only source of warmth during Reno's cold winters. "This is temporary, Mom," Derek said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Just until we can figure out a more permanent solution." I knew what the permanent solution was supposed to be. Crystal wanted me in a nursing home where I'd be out of sight and out of mind. The attic was just a way station designed to make me so miserable that I'd beg to be placed in institutional care. But what Crystal didn't know was that her cruelty had awakened something in me that had been dormant since Frank's death, a fierce determination to fight for my dignity and my rightful place in my son's life. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning while Crystal was at work and Derek was out investigating an insurance claim in Carson City. I was sitting in the sweltering attic, feeling sorry for myself and wondering how my life had become so small when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Martinez Law Firm, and I almost didn't answer because I thought it might be some kind of sales call, but something made me pick up, and what I heard on the other end of that line was about to flip Crystal's world upside down. "Is this Vera Blackwood?" asked a professional female voice. "Yes, this is Vera." "Mrs. Blackwood, this is Patricia Martinez from Martinez Law Firm here in Las Vegas. I believe my daughter Crystal is married to your son Derek." My heart started racing. Crystal's mother was a lawyer? Crystal had always been vague about her family background, claiming her parents lived in California and that they weren't close. "Yes, Crystal is my daughter-in-law," I said carefully. "Mrs. Blackwood, I need to ask you some very important questions about Crystal's behavior toward you. Has she been attempting to isolate you from your son or pressure you to move into institutional care?" I was so shocked I could barely speak. "How did you? Why are you asking me this?" "Because, Mrs. Blackwood, my daughter has done this before. 3 times, in fact. And her previous victims are now pursuing criminal charges against her for elder abuse and financial exploitation." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Crystal had done this before? She had a history of targeting elderly parents and manipulating their children against them? Patricia Martinez explained that Crystal's real name was Crystal Rodriguez, and that she'd been married 3 times previously under different names. In each case, she'd targeted men with aging parents who had assets or property that could be exploited. She would marry the son, systematically isolate the elderly parent, and then either steal their assets directly or manipulate the son into signing power of attorney documents that gave her control over the parent's finances. Her first victim was an 82-year-old man in Phoenix, whose son she married in 2018, Patricia continued. She convinced the son that his father was developing dementia, had him declared incompetent, and then transferred $200,000 from his accounts to her own before disappearing. I felt sick to my stomach as Patricia described 2 more similar cases in Tucson and Albuquerque. Crystal's pattern was always the same: charm the son, isolate the parent, create conditions that made the parent seem dependent or incompetent, and then exploit the situation for financial gain. "Mrs. Blackwood, I've been searching for my daughter for 2 years," Patricia said, her voice heavy with shame and grief. "She's been estranged from our family since she was arrested for fraud in 2017, but she jumped bail and disappeared. When I saw her marriage announcement to your son in the Reno newspaper, I knew she was about to target another family. But why didn't you contact us sooner?" I asked, my mind reeling from these revelations. "I tried," Patricia replied. "I sent letters to Derek's workplace and your address, but I suspect Crystal intercepted them. I've been working with law enforcement and private investigators to build a case against her, and we finally have enough evidence to arrest her. But we needed confirmation that she was following her usual pattern with your family." That's when Patricia asked me the questions that made everything click into place. Had Crystal isolated me from Derek? Yes. Had she suggested I was becoming mentally incompetent? Yes. Had she pressured Derek to gain power of attorney over my finances? Not yet, but I suspected that was coming next. "Mrs. Blackwood," Has Crystal or Derek asked you to sign any legal documents recently? Any powers of attorney, will be changes or property transfers? No, I said. But Derek has been talking about helping me organize my finances and making sure my affairs are in order. That's the next phase of her operation, Patricia said grimly. She's conditioning him to believe that you can't handle your own affairs, and soon she'll pressure him to take legal control of your assets. Once she has access to your finances, she'll drain your accounts and disappear, leaving Derek devastated and you with nothing. I realized that Crystal hadn't married Derek because she loved him. She'd targeted him because I represented a financial opportunity. My modest savings, Frank's life insurance money, and my small apartment might not seem like much, but to a professional con artist, they represented easy money from a vulnerable elderly woman. But Patricia had more shocking news. The FBI had been tracking Crystal's activities across multiple states, and they were preparing to arrest her on federal fraud charges. They'd been building a case for months, documenting her pattern of elder abuse and financial exploitation. Mrs. Blackwood, we need your help to catch her in the act, Patricia said. Would you be willing to cooperate with law enforcement to document what she's doing to you? Without hesitation, I agreed. Crystal had destroyed my relationship with my son, stolen my dignity, and tried to convince everyone that I was a burden who needed to be hidden away. But more importantly, she'd victimized other elderly people and their families, and she needed to be stopped before she could hurt anyone else. Patricia connected me with FBI Special Agent Rebecca Chen, who specialized in elder fraud cases. Agent Chen explained that they wanted me to document Crystal's behavior while pretending that nothing had changed. They would provide me with recording equipment and legal support, and they would arrest Crystal as soon as they had sufficient evidence of her attempting to gain control of my finances. Mrs. Blackwood, Agent Chen said, I want you to understand that what you've experienced is not normal family conflict. Crystal Rodriguez is a dangerous criminal who has destroyed multiple families across the Southwest. Your cooperation will help us put her in prison and prevent her from victimizing other elderly people. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of purpose and hope. I wasn't a burden who deserved to be hidden in an attic. I was the victim of a sophisticated criminal who had been manipulating my son and exploiting my vulnerability. The sting operation began the next day. I returned to the house acting like my usual defeated self, while secretly wearing recording equipment that documented every cruel comment Crystal made and every manipulation she used against Derek. But I also decided to take some initiative. That evening, when Derek came home from work, I asked him to sit down for a serious conversation about my future. Derek, I said, Crystal is right that I need to get my affairs in order. Maybe you should have power of attorney over my finances so that you can help me make better decisions about my money. Crystal's eyes lit up with greed and satisfaction. This was exactly what she'd been working toward for months. That's very wise, Mom, Derek said, though I could see he felt conflicted about the idea. I just want to make sure you're protected and that your money is managed responsibly. I think we should meet with a lawyer this week, I continued, following the script Agent Chen had provided. I want to transfer my accounts to your name so you can handle all my financial decisions going forward. Crystal could barely contain her excitement. After Derek went to bed, she cornered me in the kitchen with a cruel smile I'd never seen before. Good choice, Vera, she said, dropping all pretense of politeness. You've finally accepted that you're too old and stupid to manage your own life. Once Derek has control of your money, we'll find you at a nice nursing home where you won't be our problem anymore. I pretended to be hurt and defeated, but inside I was furious that this woman had been manipulating my son while planning to steal everything Frank and I had worked for during our 40-year marriage. The next morning, Crystal insisted on driving me to the bank to begin the process of transferring my accounts to Derek's name. What she didn't know was that FBI agents would be waiting for us there. As we pulled into the parking lot of First National Bank, I saw Agent Chen and 2 other agents positioned near the entrance. Crystal was practically vibrating with excitement as we walked toward the door. "Finally," she muttered under her breath. "This old bat is going to sign over her money, and then we can get rid of her permanently." But instead of entering the bank, Agent Chen stepped forward and blocked our path. "Crystal Rodriguez," she said, displaying her FBI badge, "you're under arrest for elder abuse, wire fraud, and racketeering." The look of shock and terror on Crystal's face was something I'll never forget. For months, she'd been the one in control, manipulating and tormenting me while convincing Derek that I was the problem. But suddenly, she was the one in handcuffs, and I was the one standing tall with law enforcement support. "You can't prove anything," Crystal snarled as agents read her rights. "Vera's just a confused old woman who doesn't know what she's talking about." "Actually," Agent Chen replied, "we have recordings of you admitting to financial exploitation, documentation of your previous victims across 3 states, and evidence of your real identity as a serial elder abuser." As Crystal was led away in handcuffs, Derek arrived at the bank in response to Agent Chen's phone call. His face went through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally devastation as Agent Chen explained his wife's true identity and criminal history. "This can't be real," Derek kept saying. "Crystal loves me. We're married. She was trying to help Mom." But as Agent Chen showed him the evidence of Crystal's previous marriages and crimes, and as he listened to recordings of her describing me as a burden to be disposed of, Derek began to understand how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. "She never loved me," he said, his voice breaking. "I was just another mark, another victim whose family she could exploit." The hardest part was watching Derek realize how cruelly he'd treated me under Crystal's influence. He broke down crying as he understood that his wife had systematically turned him against his own mother in order to steal my life savings. "Mom," he sobbed, "I'm so sorry. I can't believe what I put you through. I can't believe I let her convince me that you were the problem when she was destroying our family." The trial that followed made national news because of the scope of Crystal's crimes and the sophisticated nature of her elder abuse operation. During the 3-week proceedings, I testified about the months of psychological torture I'd endured, describing in detail how Crystal had systematically isolated me from Derek and tried to convince everyone that I was mentally incompetent. The prosecution presented evidence of Crystal's elaborate fraud operation, including fake identification documents, forged marriage certificates, and detailed files she'd kept on all her victims. They revealed that she'd been operating under at least 6 different identities over the past decade, targeting elderly people in Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, California, and Texas. Crystal Rodriguez is not just a con artist, prosecutor Maria Santos told the jury during her closing arguments. She is a predator who specifically targets the most vulnerable members of our society, elderly parents who love their children and trust their families to protect them. She weaponizes that love and trust to destroy families while stealing life savings that represent decades of hard work. The most devastating testimony came from the families of Crystal's previous victims. An elderly man from Phoenix described how Crystal had convinced his son that he was developing Alzheimer's disease, leading to his placement in a nursing home while she drained his accounts. A widow from Tucson testified about losing her home after Crystal convinced her daughter that she was no longer capable of managing her own property. "She destroyed my relationship with my daughter," the widow said through tears. "Even after the truth came out, my daughter couldn't forgive herself for believing Crystal's lies about me. We barely speak now because the guilt is too much for her to handle." Derek was called as a witness for the prosecution, and watching him testify about how he'd been manipulated was one of the most difficult experiences of my life. He described in detail how Crystal had gradually poisoned his perception of me, making him believe that his loving mother had become a clingy, dependent burden. "She convinced me that my mother was manipulating me emotionally," Derek said, his voice breaking. "She made me feel guilty for wanting to spend time with my mom, for caring about her feelings, for maintaining the close relationship we'd always had. She told me that healthy adult children establish boundaries with their parents, and that I was being weak by letting my mother control my life. The defense attorney tried to argue that Crystal was simply a woman who'd made poor choices, but the evidence of her systematic targeting of elderly victims made it clear that this was a calculated criminal enterprise. The FBI had documented her pattern of behavior across multiple states, showing how she would research potential victims, establish relationships with their adult children, and then execute identical schemes to gain control of their assets. During Crystal's sentencing hearing, she finally revealed the depth of her sociopathy. Instead of showing remorse, she blamed her victims for being too trusting and claimed that elderly people who couldn't protect themselves deserved to lose their money. "These old people are burdens on their families anyway," she said in a statement that shocked the courtroom. "I was just helping their children realize that the money was better used by people who could actually contribute to society." Judge Harrison sentenced her to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, calling her crimes among the most callous and calculated examples of elder abuse he'd seen in 30 years on the bench. The defendant has shown a complete lack of empathy for her victims and no remorse for the devastating impact of her crimes, Judge Harrison said. "She has destroyed families, stolen life savings, and caused immeasurable emotional trauma to some of our most vulnerable citizens." This sentence reflects the seriousness of her crimes and the need to protect other elderly Americans from similar predators. The months following Crystal's conviction have been a journey of healing and rebuilding for Derek and me. We've both been working with therapists who specialize in family trauma, learning how to process what happened and rebuild trust in our relationship. Derek has struggled deeply with guilt over how he treated me under Crystal's influence. He's had to confront the fact that someone he loved and trusted manipulated him into emotionally abusing his own mother, and the shame has been overwhelming for him at times. "Mom, I keep thinking about that attic," he told me during one of our therapy sessions together. "I put my 8-year-old mother in a hot, cramped attic because my wife convinced me you were a burden. I can't forgive myself for that. I can't believe I let someone turn me against the woman who sacrificed everything to raise me." But our therapist, Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, no relation to Crystal, helped us understand that Derek was as much a victim of Crystal's manipulation as I was. Crystal had specifically targeted him because of his close relationship with me, knowing that turning him against me would cause maximum emotional damage while giving her access to my assets. Crystal Rodriguez is what we call a sophisticated manipulator, Dr. Rodriguez explained. She studied Derek's psychological profile and exploited his deepest fears about being perceived as dependent on his mother. She used his love for you as a weapon against both of you, convincing him that caring about your well-being was a character flaw rather than a sign of a healthy relationship. The healing process has been gradual but steady. Derek moved me back into my apartment immediately after Crystal's arrest, and he's been incredibly supportive of my return to independent living. He's also become an advocate for elder abuse awareness, working with local law enforcement and social services to educate families about the warning signs of financial exploitation. We've established new routines that honor both my independence and our close relationship. Derek visits twice a week for dinner. We have our Sunday movie nights again, and he includes me in family decisions without making me feel like a burden. Most importantly, we've learned to communicate openly about any concerns or fears, instead of letting outside influences poison our relationship. The investigation into Crystal's crimes revealed the full scope of her operation, which was far more extensive than anyone had initially realized. FBI agents discovered that she'd stolen over $1.2 million from elderly victims across 6 states over a 7-year period. She'd targeted at least 15 families, though investigators suspect there may be additional victims who haven't come forward yet. The recovered funds were returned to the families she'd victimized, though the emotional damage she caused will take much longer to heal. Several of her victims had died before seeing justice served, including the elderly, man from Phoenix whose son never recovered from the guilt of believing Crystal's lies about his father's mental capacity. Patricia Martinez, Crystal's mother, has become an unexpected ally in my healing process. She reached out to all of Crystal's victims after the trial, expressing her profound regret for her daughter's crimes and offering to help with victim impact statements and restitution claims. "I failed as a mother," Patricia told me during one of our phone conversations. "I enabled Crystal's narcissistic behavior when she was young because I thought I was being supportive. I didn't recognize that she was developing into someone who could hurt innocent people without feeling any remorse." Patricia has since become an advocate for victims of family fraud, working with law enforcement agencies to develop better protocols for investigating elder abuse cases. She's also established a foundation that provides legal assistance to elderly victims of financial exploitation, using money from her successful law practice to help families fight back against predators like her daughter. 6 months after Crystal's conviction, Derek proposed a family project that has helped solidify our rebuilt relationship. He suggested that we work together to renovate my apartment, updating it with safety features and modern conveniences while preserving the memories and character that make it feel like home. "Mom, I want to make sure you can live independently for as long as possible," he said, "but I also want to make sure you're safe and comfortable. Let's create a space that reflects how much I value you and respect your independence." We spent 2 months working together on the renovation, installing grab bars in the bathroom, updating the kitchen with easier-to-reach cabinets, and adding a medical alert system that gives us both peace of mind. But more than the physical improvements, the project gave us time to talk through what had happened and to rebuild our emotional connection. During those renovation weeks, Derek shared details about Crystal's manipulation that helped me understand just how systematic her campaign against me had been. She'd researched techniques used by cult leaders and abusive partners, using psychological manipulation tactics to isolate him from me while making him believe he was making independent decisions. "She never directly told me to stop visiting you," Derek explained while we painted my bedroom together. "Instead, she'd schedule activities during our usual dinner times and then act surprised when I realized I was missing our plans. She'd suggest that you seemed needy when you called, but frame it as concern for your emotional well-being rather than criticism." Crystal had also been collecting information about my daily routines, my health concerns, and my financial situation, using that knowledge to create problems that would make me seem incompetent or dependent. She'd call my apartment when she knew I was out, then tell Derek I wasn't answering my phone and might be having health issues. She'd mentioned concerns about my driving after learning about minor fender benders that are completely normal for drivers of any age. She was building a case against you. Derek realized every conversation, every observation, every concern was part of a larger plan to convince me that you couldn't take care of yourself. Today, nearly a year after that phone call from Patricia Martinez changed everything. I'm living independently in my renovated apartment and thriving in ways I couldn't have imagined during those dark months in Crystal's attic. I've returned to volunteering at the animal shelter, joined a book club at the local library, and even started dating a wonderful man named Robert who treats me with the respect and kindness I deserve. Derek has found love again, too, with a genuinely caring woman named Sarah who works as a social worker specializing in elder services. Sarah was actually involved in the investigation of Crystal's crimes, and her professional experience has helped Derek understand the scope of what happened to our family. What Crystal did to you and Derek represents one of the most sophisticated elder abuse schemes I've ever encountered, Sarah told me during our first meeting. The psychological manipulation, the systematic isolation, the financial targeting, it was all carefully planned and executed by someone who knew exactly how to exploit family dynamics. But Sarah has also helped Derek and me appreciate how strong our original relationship was, and how that strength ultimately protected us from permanent damage. Crystal succeeded in separating us temporarily, But she couldn't destroy the foundational love and trust we'd built over Derek's lifetime. I've also become involved in elder rights advocacy, working with local organizations to educate seniors about financial exploitation and family fraud. I speak at community centers and senior groups, sharing my story and helping other elderly people recognize the warning signs of manipulation. The most important thing I want people to understand, I tell audiences, is that being elderly doesn't mean you have to accept disrespectful treatment from anyone, including family members. If someone is trying to isolate you, control your finances, or convince others that you're incompetent, those are red flags that deserve investigation. The experience also taught me valuable lessons about trusting my instincts and advocating for myself, even when the people closest to me were dismissing my concerns. When I felt uncomfortable with Crystal's behavior, when I noticed Derek changing toward me, when I suspected something was wrong, those feelings were valid and deserved to be taken seriously. Looking back on those months in the attic, I realized they represented the lowest point of my life since Frank's death. I felt worthless, unwanted, and convinced that I was indeed the burden Crystal had made me out to be. But that phone call from Patricia Martinez reminded me that I had value, that I deserved respect, and that I had the right to fight for my dignity. I'm Vera Blackwood, and at 69, I'm living proof that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, to demand justice, and to rebuild relationships that have been damaged by outside manipulation. Crystal Rodriguez thought she could break my spirit and steal my life, but she underestimated the strength that comes from knowing you deserve better. That cramped, sweltering attic was supposed to be my final humiliation before being shipped off to a nursing home. Instead, it became the launching pad for the fight that brought down a serial predator and restored my relationship with my son. Sometimes the darkest moments in our lives are actually the beginning of our greatest victories.